the death of retailing starts.
I will tell you, the arrival of the mall crushed more mom and pop stores in America. It changed America forever. And my father's store was one of them.
The protections that came out of the New Deal and in the late 30s, one of which called the Miller-Tydings Act, which protected smaller retailers because it didn't allow price discrimination based on volume discount. So that allowed, prevented the kind of discount retailers from having an edge.
New York used to be a thriving small town of 50,000 with a downtown. My father's store was downtown. It was 350 North Main Street. There were very nice department stores like the Gordon Coy, Izzard's, Rosenblum's. That there is nothing.
Already they have an edge because their stores, it's much less expensive to operate. But it wasn't until the 1970s, and actually 1975, that all of those the pricing protections that were built in were dismantled by the Consumer Pricing Act, which essentially consolidated power amongst the largest players. That would be your Walmart and Target. And in fact, Sam Walton lobbied Washington in the late 60s for these legislative changes that paved the way for big box stores and made it much harder for the smaller retailers.
I went to Georgetown. One guy went to Notre Dame. Anyway, so I went to Georgetown. And then I got down to A&S, which is located in Brooklyn, New York. And then I was on the July trading squad. One guy named Frank Pincus had a master's from Wharton School of Business. It was Michael Rich from Rich's in Atlanta, which was a famous store, the store in Atlanta in the South. And I was at A&S for 6 years. And then I made a big mistake. I went to Alexander's because they offered me a lot of money. And I discovered money's not everything.
I need to introduce my grandfather. Actually, one of the main reasons I wanted to focus on retailing as emblematic of the changes in American business was because both my maternal and paternal grandfathers were both involved in retailing. One owned his own clothing store. The other worked in a larger retailing establishment, Macy's. As a kid, I used to go to the Macy's Day Thanksgiving Parade, Herald Square. And of course, my father was an executive in retailing. And I think he was maybe influenced. I'll let him tell that story.
Before he does that, he's probably the lead housewares buyer. He winds up on a radio show and a television show during the daytime. A television show during the daytime as he interviewed the housewares buyer at Macy's. And he tells the lady, that how does he decide on the utensils and all of these things that he buys? And he tells him, well, I bring them home to my wife, and she tries them out and speaks very well. That's the other thing, because he was a debater. He expresses himself very forcefully, but cogently. And he wants to get right to the facts. And he has an expression that he uses with everybody. I don't want a weather report. I want to know what happened. And he has another expression, which you do it like a good fellow. And that means do it now. That means right now. So anyway. And he's the lead housewares buyer, and he reports to a man called Elliot Walter. Walter gets elevated at a vice president level. And then Elliot Walter later becomes president of Macy's. And I remember once saying to him about something else, do you ever look back? And he said, no, you don't. It's a waste of time, would it, could, it, should. I sometimes wonder, could he really do that? But he was a very disciplined man. So the business doesn't do well. It's a partnership. He pays a lot of people back, mortgages the house. I mean, unbelievable stuff. And then gets another job, comes back to Macy's eventually, after he's been out of work for a while. I'm very upset about it. And has a buying job that he'd had years ago. And works his way back. He goes out into the branches and becomes a store manager at out in Bayshore, Long Island. Then he becomes the store manager of their biggest store in Queens. And then he comes in.
Where in Queens?
Rego Park. It's the famous store in the round where the parking was around the store. I mean, it is a famous store.
Oh, there's pictures of that, right?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was a little house there that they couldn't buy. They offered the woman a lot of money. So they had to put like a dent in it, Anyway.
To build the store there?
Yeah, well, they had to build a store around it because she wouldn't sell. Anyway. And then he gets promoted into...
How many Macy's do you think there were at the peak of Macy's?
Oh, there were over 400 stores.
Where? All over the country?
Yeah, I mean, when May Company became Macy's.
Well, right, but like in his time.
In his time, there were stores in his time, there was stores in New Jersey, New York, New Jersey, and the Atlanta area.
Thinking about what Miracle on 34th Street and the stores where he worked and seeing some of the press clippings. When he retired, he was really, it's just telling very cool stories about, I think at one point, didn't Dustin Hoffman sell ties? And he wasn't very good at it. I mean, just things. But I think that's not only Macy's and the way it used to be, but also New York, which was really a different New York than we know now. But I think those elements definitely, I loved learning about those and reading about our grandfather and but otherwise I just see it overall in terms of progress and even looking at it from the benefit of, yes, we're trying to give the best price to the consumer, but ultimately these consumers work retailing. So in many cases, protecting the consumer costs them their jobs.
Right. That's a good one.
So where would you like to work? And I said, well, what about California? They said, everybody says that. Our job openings now are in Bainbridge, New Jersey. I said, fine. Now, my whole background had been in ladies, in apparel and in children's. I was a children's outerwear buyer and then just did the same thing at Alexander's. So all my background is that part of it. But they wanted a different approach to clothing department, so I became a clothing buyer. And then later on, I added rainwear and outerwear, so it was an even bigger job. So I got it was in the form of a telegram. Would you consider all home furnishings Liberty House Honolulu? And I'm going, well, they've got this, they don't mean homes furnishings, they must be men's furnishings. Liberty House Honolulu, wow. So I called him up, and he went, oh my goodness, oh wow. Oh, we got the telegrams mixed, we've never done that. It's men's job in Prangies in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Liberty House Honolulu, Green Bay, Wisconsin. But at this point, this guy's great. So, I mean, just the way he does stuff. So I went out and I interviewed with a man named Stan Brenner, who's a terrific guy. And I see what it's about. And I come home and your mother and I talk it over and we decide we'll go. It's more money than I'm making and it's a nice sized job, but it's not a huge store. I become vice president, general merchandise manager of men's and children's and intimate apparel in Bergner's in Peoria, Illinois. So I was at Bell's. I was vice president, general merchandise manager, and I had men's and boys and children's and intimate apparel and shoes reported to me. From there, I went to venture stores, which was much larger. It was big volume. It was a discount store. It was a men's divisional, then later on, men's vice president of men's and boys. And I was there for 12 years. We had approximately 100 stores in Chicago and St. Louis and Kansas City and Dallas, Texas and Indianapolis, Indiana.
When Robinson May was a store, they had this thing where they had two separate physical spaces, two stores. So the men's department would be like one separate store on one side of the mall. And then on the other side of the mall would be the women's and cosmetics and all that, which I thought was a tad bizarre. A little bit of a waste of space.
May Company bought Robinson's and made it Rob May. But they already had a May Company California. So they probably owned the building, and then the other building they acquired was Robinson. So they didn't build two buildings.
Kind of the typical, story of American business, bigger companies, conglomerates, gobbling up each other one after the other, go to the other side. And you'll see the empty building, pretty much, that was the other Macy's or / Robinson May. And as you can see, boarded up, empty, not currently being used.
Malls at that point, consumerism, our economy had switched from manufacturing mainly to consumption, and so there is a net benefit for lower prices, particularly around this time when you're talking about the 70s and moving into the 80s, where inflation is much, much higher. So that ultimately does benefit the consumer. But towards the end of the 1980s, there's just a huge explosion in the square footage of shopping centers to the point where it had just saturated the population. At one point, and I think this might have been 1990 or 91, it was determined that there were 24 square feet per American citizen in retail space.
We would think that Estee Lauder, which is back there, would want to be up front, but very often they don't want to be because this is called the blow-by point. People don't start looking until they get in the building, so they can easily walk past these front cases before they're focusing on what's going on. Okay, so what we saw yesterday with what's going on with the Chesterfield Mall is an economic idea of what is called the tragedy of the commons. And basically what it is a situation in which individuals access to shared resource, in this case it would be a market, act in their own interest and in doing so ultimately deplete the resource. So, probably originally started, if you looked at farming, and let's say you had an open field, and a lot of people had access for their animals to feed on that field. Well, eventually, if you kept on adding animals, you would overuse by all of these animals. So that would be the tragedy of the commons. The other thing is a law that existed for a long, was first promulgated by David Ricardo, one of the early economists, And that was the law of comparative advantages, in that some countries had lower labor costs or better ways of producing something more so than other countries. So consequently, we can see you built supply chains based on that ability to produce things. And so England was one of the great traders in the world, in which they traded all over the world. They traded all over the world, producing, taking production from one country and or resources from one country produced in another country. And of course, they had a great navy that protected the sea lanes.
Soon as the mall, and it was at the outskirts of town, not far from the airport. Slowly, very slowly, people were just enamored because there were all these stores in one spot.
Much retail space for the amount of business that you're going to do. And so consequently, you're cannibalizing it. So in other words, you've got almost too many options. And so stores move into an area. And let's say that area could do $100 million. And there's a point at which where the additional stores move in, you don't move off that $100 million. Everybody there still does $100 million, but the individual stores do less business. Some stores don't lose any business, they may grow. Some stores may grow not at all, and some stores may go out of business. So what happens is that, for instance, when you saw the malls and that kind of stuff, when the mall came in, there were downtown stores that were older and people didn't go to them anymore. They went to, it's like what your mother talked about with Jim, her dad's store. So people went out to the mall and they didn't shop downtown. And what happens here is you have this mall doing X amount of business. You now start opening up stores around it, and some of that business goes there. So the mall starts doing less business with the same amount of stores. It's a perfect example of being overstored.
Manufacturing presence here, if you're talking about textiles, really, and this one could see in the 50s and 60s, they're just, in order to offer the best price to the end consumer, we just did not have the manufacturing. I say we, the United States did not have the ability to manufacture goods and textiles of the quality at a certain price that one could find in Asia. Part of it was unionization. So just the expense per piece of good, they're built into that were healthcare costs and pensions. And also the quality suffered. So it really, as far as the discount model, there's just no really effective way to source goods over here and actually offer something at a discount. But even you see this evolution because even the Walmart and the Target and Venture and Kmart were insulated because there was a deeper discounter that came along in the form of the dollar store, Family Dollar, Dollar General, where things were roughly $1. And they particularly in times of recession, a family could buy any number of things, some garments, but groceries, cleaning supplies, all of those things could extend a family's dollar. And that put enormous pressure on Walmart and Target and Kmart. One of the other issues too is how it's financed, how these firms are financed. Oftentimes they have bloated balance sheets, loaded with debt, and private equity firms will step in, which is not a lifeline because the private equity, these leverage buyouts, further encumber these firms' balance sheets with just unserviceable debt. It's just overwhelming. And so you see a lot of bankruptcies from that.
Off the rack, Nordstrom started, and Saks Fifth Avenue did it, and and then Van Heusen had a whole business of it. Polo, they did this off price, and then there's Marshalls and TJ Maxx, which buy stuff from manufacturers like Nike and that kind of thing. They're off pricers, and it's not necessarily, they're a little bit different than discounters because discounters have the goods made for them. In this particular case, Marshalls and TJ Maxx, and also DSW, for the shoes, those are all they all come from brands which sell them direct. And some of it is discontinued styles and that kind of stuff, but they're great bargains. Well, you have all of that going on. Yeah, that's more competition. It's great value to the consumer, but it's competition. And then, on top of that, you have what we were called as category killers. Basically, they were category, and they surrounded them all, and they were like Home Depot and Lowe's, maybe Dick's, sporting goods. And look at the size of this place down here. And then you had discounters like Target and Walmart. But look. Now this is vibrant. This is going strong. Dick's is tremendous in sporting goods.
Again, emblematic of business in America and why there is a certain unrest amongst middle class, kind of a pinch on middle class jobs.
And my father finally sold his store to someone else and retired at the age of 72. And that store later on became a taqueria. That is no lie. And next to him used to be a piano store where they sold concert pianos. And the Kanabi piano I have here, my father bought for me. And there was a photographer shop. There were like 8 or 9 little stores in my father's Dunn building, which was owned by a friend of ours. So, yes, I will tell you, malls killed American small businesses.
Into retailing, a lot of the import was coming from Europe. Knits from Italy, and Israel's a big market, and outerwear from France and England. But slowly and surely, everything began to move to the Far East. One of the things, of course, was the prices were lower because of labor, but also they became very, very good manufacturers, very high quality manufacturers.
Yeah, as Dad did say, I got to travel the world and was paid to do it because so much of, and now that on the discount side, so we're not talking, it's a very different sourcing goods, it's very different, or certainly somewhat different when you're talking about Bergdorf Goodman. But on the discount side, that he went all over Asia. I think he visited every continent, maybe except Antarctica. So I think that's fascinating. And also seeing, and I remember asking him about, the United States used to be such a strong manufacturing presence. So you're telling me, really, we can't get the red T-shirt from a manufacturer in the United States? And he would talk about, no, we really can't. Not and actually offer it at a price that a consumer will actually pay. And that changed a little bit. There was a knitwear company that came out. I remember the guy who was just a lawsuit magnet, American Apparel. and they manufactured goods in the United States as a total departure from where things had been sourced. And we're any kind of knitwear, yoga pants, t-shirts, polo shirts, all of it. But for the most part, you just could not get goods in the quantity and the quality that you could get in Asia.
In Taiwan and also Korea. Korea made apparel, and the quality was just absolutely excellent. There was a famous company in Hong Kong that made shirts, and the shirts were like diamonds. I mean, they just made a great quality of product. And in those years, many of the athletic shoes came out of Taiwan. Well, what happened in Korea was they wanted to get into the much more capital goods industries. They were involved in shipbuilding. And then when they got into electronics, involved in a supply chain, which we bought sample yardage, piece goods in Taiwan, which is a great fabric market. We copied the piece goods in China and had it manufactured in Latin America. And we had many people did that kind of thing. And so it was a rather complicated, maybe a complicated supply chain, but it was very effective for both quality and price points. And that also happened in Taiwan. And but a lot of markets like Thailand remained very good for us, and of course India and Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, on the other hand, was an interesting situation, is because when they first started, they didn't have anything. Meaning they had to import virtually everything, and the thread and the fabric. But what they did have is they had a willing and able labor force. And so they were very low cost. But with a lot of work and a lot of patience, their quality became quite good, more than acceptable.
He used to travel to Los Angeles and go to Magic.
However, as you go up in the business in a big retail store and you become an assistant buyer or a buyer, many times there are shows all over the United States, in LA, in, Las Vegas.
So it was always amazing. Sometimes my mom would go on some of these trips and come back with, a tan.
And those were the times that I just loved, because I got to go places that I wouldn't have gone before. To San Diego, particularly to San Diego, which I loved. New York periodically, but I've been to New York since I was a child. And one time, a European trip to Italy and France. But I'd already been there. But, it's very exciting to go with your husband.
In the middle of January. It's usually, it was either the end of January or very early February, which was, pretty brutal in the Midwest or back east. So it's ironic that Magic, the Manufacturers Association Guild in California, here in Los Angeles.
The Men's Apparel Guild in California, and the idea was to travel out to California and under one roof to see California resources. It was mostly sportswear, swimwear, that kind of thing. And the idea was California resources could visit with retailers from all over the country. They were very successful, of course, locally, but they wanted to have a wider audience with particular stores from the Midwest and the East Coast. And so the biggest one out there was Levi Strauss, but there were a lot of active sportswear, swimwear resources that had an opportunity. So initially that show was in Palm Springs. And in the winter, it was in San Diego. Then it outgrew Palm Springs because they were using lots of hotels, and using to show, and they needed a convention center. So then they moved to San Diego, and San Diego ultimately became too small for the show because, again, they had to use lots of hotels and they didn't really have the huge convention center. So they moved to Los Angeles and used the convention center there. And then I believe they outgrew it, but also I think the convention center closed for a while because they were remodeling it. And they moved to Las Vegas. And they've been in Las Vegas ever since.
Went to the Mandalay Bay for a while, which had a huge convention space. And then it's at a smaller Las Vegas convention center. I don't think it's anywhere near the same event that it used to be.
One thing, and I remember we were looking at colleges in New York, and he had a meeting with Nautica. And I remember sitting, it shouldn't take too long, but he would negotiate how many pieces and this and mark down money. And I remember, I think I must have sat in the lobby for like 3 hours for what was supposed to be 45 minutes. I mean, there is, beyond my being rather frustrated, sitting there with, and thinking, okay, I'm just going to get up and leave and wander around New York, which he would have had a heart attack. But also the amount of negotiation is really, it's almost State Department-esque because you're trying to get the best price, but these vendors you have to have this relationship with, you can't antagonize them. So I think that was kind of fascinating.
You're negotiating, you might be negotiating price, you might be negotiating that you need more quantity from them and that kind of stuff. But when you're negotiating, you have to point out to the other people it's in their best interest to help you to accomplish this. You can't negotiate, with take it or leave it kind of thing because you might, So the negotiation takes some time in presenting your case and why your case makes a great deal of sense with the manufacturer. Now, it's called retail negotiation skills, and it requires some empathy in that you have to make requests that are reasonable. And because at the end of the day, you want it to be a pretty good deal for the other side of it so that you can continue your relationship with the buyer.
Well, it's not as glamorous as it always looked like it would be on Friends. It's not just picking out nice merchandise. Probably 90% or more of the job is business related, developing business plans, marketing plans, working with the branch stores on how to display merchandise, working with manufacturers. Lots of negotiation goes into the purchases. And then you have to get the merchandise delivered into the stores through the distribution system.
It's going to take a toll on the family because like 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, twice a year, it was not onerous. Now, for manufacturers, it is a different story, and I experienced that a little bit in the sourcing. That is a much longer trip.
You are gone a lot more. And if there's a young family, then your wife obviously is responsible for the children, for the finances, or writing the bills. If something breaks, like I had the furnace break once during a cold wave, went off, and it was a time when you used to have the oil was delivered to your house. So you didn't know whether if you're smelling oil, you don't know exactly what's going on. So you've got to, plead with heating people to come and tell them, my husband is gone and I have a child and we have no heat. And it's 21 degrees out. So you had to deal with plumbing issues, health issues. If your children were ill and cried at night, you still had to get up and make the sandwiches and send them off to school. If your baby was sick, and my children were 8.5 years apart. So obviously that made a difference. It can be a difficult life.
The rest of the time it's fun. Traveling and picking out the merchandise, that's the fun part, but that's not what most of the job
Part of it
entails.
was the Daily News Record. And Women's Wear Daily was the women's part of it. So you read the Daily News Record because you got ideas of what was going on. You learned what was going on in the industry. You also get the information from, going through and seeing the resources on a regular basis and that kind of thing. When you went out to California, you definitely saw it in the stores that a lot of the sportswear information was coming out of California. The whole surf thing, the whole, California had much more, because of the weather, the outdoor part of it. The very trendy people are wearing it. Not everybody is wearing it. And then some of it moves, like in a distribution curve, moves to dominant sell, where it's selling. A lot of people are buying.
So that your had come fashion department.
Yeah, we had a fashion department. Well, yes. Yeah. And we had a group who just worked on our own imports and that kind of stuff. We had a color service, because what colors are trending, what colors are red hot. It's a huge industry. Color.
Yeah, I don't think he never wasn't working. But I don't know how. I think that's the same. I mean, anyone who's diligent. And, but he was always working.
What's kind of the volume that you were personally responsible for?
That was significant. $300 million. I mean, but you don't have to put that in, but it was significant volume.
So you were overseeing how much business a year did Venture do? That's high.
I think well over $2 billion.
And I think there is a sense of when you've been in an industry for that long and you've seen it from this, the 60s, the early 60s, when there were still antitrust provisions and you still had 5 and 10, Franklin 5 and 10, you still had smaller or even smaller department stores. And then you're working in, the 80s and you can see what has happened. The consolidation, places you used to work don't exist anymore. That colleagues that you had a decade ago are an entirely different industry because there just aren't any jobs. I think that definitely weighs in the back of your mind that your game has to be on point.
When it comes to the part of the job where you actually are selecting merchandise, and because I've always been in a fashion business, we're very trend conscious. But most of the trends in the department store level, it's not just some brilliant buyer that makes them up. The industry is ahead of us. They already have the merchandise either planned to be manufactured, sometimes it's already manufactured, and they start watching the trends even before the merchants in the buying end do. So it sounds odd, but it is very true that when you make a market trip to New York and you work maybe with your top 6 denim resources, they all will be on trend with a lot of the same things, whether that's a lowered waist, a high-waisted jean, whether it's a light wash denim, a dark wash denim. These things don't just happen in a vacuum. They kind of evolve, and everybody who is watching for these trends sees them at pretty much the same time. So at the end of each month, if we have not made our business plan, if we have not made our numbers, retail is just like any other business. The only way we're successful is if we make a profit. To take fewer markdowns, we need to get some vendors to renegotiate on some things so that we can make up whatever profits we may have lost the month before. Because at the end of the year, when you are evaluated, if you have not made your profit plan, that will not be a good thing. I'm not saying that you would be fired, but that would not make for a good review.
Did you ever have, were you in that?
I had one. I had one bad review.
In how many years?
30.
It sounds like she was an excellent buyer. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What, from your standpoint, what makes an excellent buyer?
Well, obviously, you look at their numbers, but they're on top of what's happening. They're on top of their business. And they're also developing people. And they're reasonable people to deal with. You know, you can get some people who are very, very creative, and they're not easy to deal with. They're not easy to have criticism to. They're not easy to change their mind. They can be unpleasant people. And they fall back on artistry, that they're artists and that kind of stuff. And while there's a great deal of creativity in retailing, I don't think we're art.
And so what do you think made a good boss?
Somebody who could be a good bridge between a buyer and senior management. Somebody who could help carry the load, but who gave you enough leeway to run your own business. So somebody who had good ideas, somebody who was calm. There are a lot of people in retail who go around with their hair on fire half the time. And that's not usually very productive.
Was he a good boss?
He was a good boss because he was always very clear with what he expected and had great relationships with the manufacturers. And if manufacturers like your boss, that's kind of that's a good way to start your relationship with them. But boy, you don't want to walk into a vendor where you have a boss who on some other occasion has really taken advantage of the manufacturer or just been a pain in the neck to work with. That's not helpful.
What do you say to that?
Are you recording me?
Yeah.
I think it's magical thinking. I think that, what jobs are you going to bring back? I can't believe you're going to bring back needle trade, sewing and that kind of stuff. And, are you going to bring back advanced manufacturing? Maybe. Are you going to build the plants? Maybe.
Well, in the case of retailing, why can't you not do that?
Well, it's not retail. It's the wholesale part
Or
of
the
it.
wholesale, rather, yeah.
Fabric and that kind of stuff. You mean like dresses and coats and that? So, those plants are all closed. I mean, where are you going to manufacture this stuff? You're going to reopen those plants, put new machinery in there, hire people, train them? You're going to do that?
Well, explain why it's not efficient. How good, as you mentioned. Just walk us through that a little bit. Why it's so unreasonable.
Well, look, those plants have been closed for years. And you're going to have to bring, and manufacturing's moved on. There's new machinery and that kind of stuff throughout the world. And many, so those plants will not only have to be reopened, but they're going to have to be brought up to date. And those workers are gone. You're going to have to get a new group of workers and train them. You know, and you're going to have to pay them a living wage in the United States. So, you know, you're going to need a lot of capital to do it, and your labor costs are going to be higher. Now, you don't have the shipping expense, maybe you don't have the insurance expense, maybe there's a lot of expenses you do not have that are associated with making offshore, and you don't have to pay the duty. But still, you know, it might be still you're going to have to charge a much higher price. If you look what I think it's called, you know, American Giant charges for fleece, take a look at those prices. I'm sure the quality is absolutely great, but you know, might be hard to be it. And I don't know if anybody has said, okay, this is where we're going to put the plants. These are our opportunities and that kind of thing.
To give the best price to the consumer, but ultimately these consumers work retailing. So in many cases, protecting the consumer costs them their jobs.
A huge manufacturing center, gone. Thatcher Glass, gone. A&P Canning, gone. Yeah, I saw it.
Maybe this could be a good second income for a woman, you know, who was married with kids and could, you know, make some money in cosmetics and make, you know, good commission and so forth. You know, again, you're not going to make, you know, yes, those jobs went over to Walmart and Target and so forth, you know, great, but you're not, you know, no one's making any commission at Walmart, you know, and that's it's just a switch out one job for the other. No, not really. You know, the money didn't work out the same. There's no question about that, you know.
Look, to certain people, certain things happened that are bad. Certain people got cancer. That doesn't mean everybody gets cancer. You have an agenda there. What you're talking about is you're looking at a segment that is diminishing, which is the department store business, which has been consolidating for years, and stores, and it hasn't. But I think we'd have to take a look and see what department store volume is. What you're looking at is real estate that is disappearing, and stores, you know, malls that are getting into trouble or closing and are empty, like we went through the Chesterfield Mall. But you could see yesterday that was like almost perfect example of the tragedy of the commons. What has clearly grown is Target and Walmart and Amazon. So the title is absolutely wrong. The business is not disappearing, it is changing. And retailing will always change because it will change as the consumer changes, as everything changes. Joe, what you have done is you have an agenda.
I don't have.
Yeah, of course you do. Everybody.
You're on film. You're on tape right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We all agree that there is a huge income inequality. The business has changed, but has it changed for the better?
Well, that's a completely different than retailing is dead.
Well, you know, that's not necessarily the title.
You ask me questions that I have very strong opinions about, and you don't want me to have the opinions because they don't fit.
This is in the film.
I understand.
This is in the film.
But you have
not going to be edited out.
But of course you can edit it out. There's some stuff that should be.
This is going to be in the film.
I understand.
Yeah. The question is, yes, that's true. You say, from an executive point of view, right, which is your point of view, and which a lot of, you know, people would say, look, it is a bigger business, let's say, on balance. But my point is, to many people, it is a losing proposition, even though you can make the case that it's bigger and better and more efficient and so on and so forth. Right?
I think years ago, people could make money as salespeople. and they could make commission, and there was an incentive. Okay. I think in some cases what happens is that the store or the organization is driving company people into the stores, and they don't need people to make commission because people are already pre-sold with the advertising or the coupons and that kind of thing. So,
like you said, the hat was a good example.
Yeah.
The hat, the suit was a good example.
No, but the commissions you didn't need the commissions anymore because you were spending so much money driving people into the store. I had some clothing salesmen who, in one store, when I was a clothing buyer, and they weren't really very good. They didn't seem to be motivated. They didn't have what we called CU list. And what the CU list is, a group of customers that you call up and said, I really got some great suits. The last time you were in, you bought a navy one from this manufacturer. I've got a beautiful gray one. I'm going to put it aside for you. Give me a call if you don't want it. I'll put it back on the floor. And they did, and we had one store who did that. And we had another store that they didn't do that. And what drove me nuts is they were getting commissions, but we were figuring out how to drive business into the store. So they were making money that not necessarily they didn't earn, but all they were doing was ringing up. We've done all the work. We didn't need to pay those guys, those particular men commission or the rate we were paying. And we were paying the same monies to the guys who had customers and that. Now, of course, they made more money because they did more business and that kind of stuff. So, but, my argument was to the stores was, the only time you're doing business is when we run a sale. You don't really have a good business and you don't good very selling staff. And it should be training people. I used to tell them these guys couldn't close a sale on a can of peas in the grocery store. I mean, they're terrible. On big sales I went in, I could sell more than those guys could. Now, I had a vested interest and I bought it and I could tell the customer more. But they weren't even good about the technical information we gave them. And we have huge change going on now in the world, So, and you had a situation with COVID where services declined because people couldn't go out and they put their money into goods. And then all of a sudden, all these stores did extremely well. But people will always be buying apparel. People will always be buying. The cosmetic people call them doors. And internet is probably a door. A website is probably a door. That is not the right title. The right title is the industry is changing, just as America is changing. You think after all of COVID, and now we have a war in Europe, that things are going to go back the way they were. They won't. We're living through dramatic change. The problem is you live it through hour by hour, day by day. It's nothing like when you look back in the history books. You can always look back and find, well, they should have done this, they should have done that, they should have seen this coming, they should have done that. And I believe it's the narrative, I've heard it called, it was in that book on Black Swan, the narrative philosophy. Because you can look at what happened and create a narrative of it, it's people should have understood it. People should have seen, the Second World coming. They should have seen what Hitler made, They should have seen who Putin really was. They should have seen what Russia's intentions were. Woulda, shoulda, coulda.
The point is, though, people are looking for a very easy answer for very complicated problems, There is no easy answer, right? The issues of today are complex. They're difficult to explain in some cases. They're difficult to understand. It's not like you just wave a magic wand and say, I'm going to bring back jobs back to the United States, or I'm going to bring back manufacturing the way it was, or I'm going to bring back,
the retailing industry to what it once was, right? Things change. And again, things are complicated. It's a complicated world we live in, and everybody, many times people are looking for a very easy solution. Someone says, "Oh, I can fix it. I alone can fix it. I have the answer. I know what to do. I'm smart enough," right? I'm a stable genius, whatever the case may be. And a lot of times it's just bullshit, man. It is complicated. Things are very complicated. I remember sending an article in the New York Times to kind of an in-law about poverty in the United States. It was the article took about an hour plus to read because it delved into the lives of like 5 or 6 different people spread out throughout the country and explained kind of the working poor, if you will. And he was like, well, his eyesight's not good. He can't really read. He can watch it on video or whatever, and that really is emblematic of, whatever. I take that at face value. But my point is, to understand something completely takes time, right? To be educated, to be knowledgeable takes time, takes effort, takes a certain ability. It's just nothing comes overnight. Again, there are just not a lot of easy answers, and I think people are looking in many cases for an easy answer. So I think this documentary, as well as the other documentaries I mentioned as part of the MAGA series, are attempting to explain things that are not really readily easy to explain. It takes some time to really delve into. So that's why, I feel like I needed 6 films to, kind of really delve into the MAGA, Make America Great Again phenomenon. The first 2 being narrative shorts, the early inauguration about the rigged system, Drain the Swamp. The second film, Ralphie's Blue, dealing with white nationalists, the rise of white nationalism and white supremacists. Third film delves into kind of the breakup of the nuclear family, the rise of the power of women, single women in America. That's a documentary, as is, this film, the death or change of an industry, the change of retailing, if you will. Film 5 would be about the opioid crisis. Film 6 would be, kind of driving through the Midwest battleground states, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, asking people, what does Make America Great Again mean to them? What does MAGA mean to them? Hopefully the 7th film will be the fictional, the narrative, the feature-length version of Ralphie's Blue, just Blue, again exploring the rise of white nationalism and white supremacy. So, again, along those lines, it takes time and effort to really delve in and understand the subject, and I think this is the subject of our time, this rise of nationalism, this whole MAGA phenomenon. You see it in Europe with Brexit. You see it with Marine Le Pen, in France and in other European countries. You see it in India with Modi. I think that it's in many ways a dangerous time, in the world. And then with, and the backdrop of all that is, climate change. So I believe that these subjects are important to delve into and really try and grasp fully.